I want to welcome you all to YouTube Masterclass. This is a COURSERA governed class by the body of COURSERA that takes you to the final and where to pay for the course credits. That this course is taught for the Harvard Film School, that hopefully more professors will gather and be able to teach film at Harvard, and that whole subject needs fundraising. It needs people with ideas for adventure. I mean, I can teach these classes into so much time, but that to put together a structure of a degree of even a 2-year junior degree of cinema at Harvard would be so appealing that if only it could happen from the history point of 1895 when cinema began. We already see film schools already by 1920 that are forming, as studios are forming by independent actor directors that controlled the most of Hollywood and left the producers in charge of the studios. And it's a beautiful story in that it all hinges around Hollywood. And the films I'm going into are actually independent films, I want to say, although they were in the Hollywood structure, that they were neo-noir, but they were still within the noir era is confusing. And I think this time I'm going to take them chronologically, and I think the first one which I want to mention is The Night of the Hunter. Now, I know the first one I want to show you is Night of the Hunter, and this is Charles Laughton directing. Now, Charles Laughton has only directed one film. Now, doesn't that remind you of Herc Harvey, except for he wasn't a famous British stage and screen actor of all the guilds and the London festivals and everything that made him popular in America, too, like in Hitchcock's Jamaica Inn, or under Capricorn, you'll see Charles Laughton. And that this has Robert Mitchum and Shelley Winters is another one of those films where Shelley Winters has really bad luck and ends up getting killed by her husband, like in Lolita. Shelley Winters suffers that part. A Place in the Sun, Shelley Winters gets killed. And there's this whole theme, like they're all doing it because the other one did it, and that's the role she was stuck in, as that cuckold. But she did have other roles than that, and Bloody Mama is one of those roles she had that was such a big, amazing spot for her that she ended up encapsulating what later would become the Godfather series, and how they would develop from the story of like Bloody Mama, or this hierarchy and these divisions up to where you get to the mother figure who plans and succeeds before she's succeeding at the plan. And I really do appreciate that Charles Laughton only had one film to make, and that it's such a Hitchcockian film is even demarcated by the love and hate on this guy's hands, that I once said that that was overkill and heavy-handed. Well, it is heavy-handed. It's on his hands, and they look like they're flying fists pretty heavy, and I don't really blame him for having whatever tattoo he wants now that I know more about the movie. But, the thing is that he's a false priest is often an early sign of, even in silent cinema, of the melodrama to come about how they're going to get rid of the preacher that's setting up the woman or the women. And now he's coming after the kids. So Lillian Gish, yes, the very one from all the D.W. Griffith films, comes into this film as the Christian caretaker of the two orphans that she's going to take care of and do battle with Robert Mitchum if she has to. And Robert Mitchum is at his most spiteful, and it's a big bad wolf story all the way, and that the shots of the boat going down the river are amazing. Are amazing. The shots of the boats going down the river are like these silhouettes of these paintings, of like these moving canvases of oil, of the boat drifting from one section to the next, and it pours in beauty. You see the light coming from one light on the set, and it's just neo-noir, that the river is jagged, and that the edge is nearby, and things look completely like a fairy tale, but are actually happening in this reality of this, like, otherwise Louisiana story-like setting in the South during the time of these kind of inveterate preacher types that would pose around getting married to women only to be gold diggers searching for their money, that he thinks the orphans that he made orphans has the money. He goes after them, and then they trip him up by meeting Lillian Gish, is where I'll lead you to, with how Charles Laughton has the cat and mouse scenario and has the whole cat either catching the mouse or the mouse escaping, or him catching the mouse and then it escaping. But either way, the story looks like it's pigmented only by the metaphors that are exaggerated, which the tall tale of the characters already do that in what Laughton is making into American mythology. The mythology of, like, the Oedipal complex is all throughout this, and that there's a distraction from Freudian intonations that in fact the Knight of the Hunter is seeking out the women to gold dig, not because he's interested in their success in the future, but only so he can take their money and let them die, find whatever money's left and go for it. That greed spells what's at Charles Laughton's American mythology, which is good because that's an Eric von Stroheim film that you can't go without. And I think that there are moments that are films like a silent film in Charles Laughton film, and that you can tell he studied up on his Hitchcock thrillers, especially when he made Night of the Hunter. That there's another Orson Welles movie that reminds me of this called Touch of Evil. That Touch of Evil is one of the Orson Welles movies, like Lady of Shanghai, that you just have to see. And Lady of Shanghai with its mirror maze, the maze of mirrors. And the thing about Orson Welles is he made so many great films, and that his film after he made F for Fake was not even going into production. It was like his version of Napoleon, and that I'm kind of spacing now on Orson Welles films, but Touch of Evil is the one that comes where he plays this cop, and he goes to Mexico, and he's trying to apprehend Charlton Heston, who's playing the Mexican, and they even mention it in, like, B-movie theater of Ed Wood, Tim Burton style. And that Orson Welles' Touch of Evil was even one of those dialogue tracks that got the main evil antagonist busted by recording what he was saying. So by recording what he was saying, they then turn it around and play it back so everyone can hear the dastardly, disgusting, horrible things he's saying about the people. And so they can hear, they turn it back up and rewind it and say, well, this is what he said, these horrible, dastardly, evil things about the people. And that's how they get him with that one, that it does this whole conversation thing where they're, like, looping in with the microphone. Is real interesting in this one. And I'm going to give it plenty of room as a film Touch of Evil, because it goes into the ideal that we're losing Janet Leigh again to another evil force that we can't, like, stop from losing. And that Janet Leigh is slowly pulled off the earth Manchurian Candidate style, but actually lives through Touch of Evil is the nice thing about the kind of happy ending, although the cop that's played by Orson Welles bribes everybody and ends up disappearing. But let's move on, because we've got a lot of Masterclass to continue, and we want to talk about a few more movies, and I don't want to talk too long about Night of the Hunter, except that one thing I'd watch out for is its pessimism. Now that we're skeptical of all films, that they don't always have an appeasement to reality, or kind of, they're not always perfunctory to be real. The Night of the Hunter does take in terms a certain pessimism or even nihilism, but that Christianity is offered on one hand as an organization that can fight back against these priests that have gone haywire is a certain offer of the film only in American folklore. And that's really not that great of a way to have to go out, that you have to basically take up the mantle of the church to win the battle. But he's already in the church and he's faking it anyway. So who's on whose side when it comes to the actual movements that they're involved in anyway, in those periods of time that they're doing the American folklore from, and which way are they siding on? And I think that's A Night of the Hunter kind of does that Salem witch trial thing, although the children that are mainly being hunted down do see from their POV, from childlike POV, different things like treasure in a boat, and that they know to sail the boat to the right spot and get away from this guy that's going to kidnap them or whatever, that's already killed their mom and he's coming after them. It's a scary movie. It's like a horror movie. It's a suspense thriller horror movie, and I can't tell you why it's important to cinema other than the camera angles and the choice of lighting and the way they directed shot to shot match on action. I mean, it's a brilliant film that it's post-classical, but all in a modern kind of Charles Lawton, a one-time out kind of guy. And that Herc Hervey only directed one film, and it was Carnival of Souls. But again, he wasn't a famous actor, or was he? Maybe he was like an extra in other movies we didn't know about, like in Incredibly Strange Films. I'm just kidding. Now, this next film I want to bring up is an important one to me because it's called Shot Corridor, and I want to get here because this is an important film not to abuse the subtext to, because if you ever end up in a cycle like this could be something that you could want to avoid, and that is that there's this kind of appeasement that these authors have with making their career work out by ending up winning the Pulitzer Prize. And now, I'm not going to talk about whether I have or not, but let's talk about this movie. The guy in this movie sets out to win so hard that he goes to a hospital and is actually checking himself in intentionally, so he says, so that he can get to the bottom of the mystery of the hospital, which all hospitals have a mystery. When he finds it, he's going to write about it, get the Pulitzer Prize. It's in the bag. Now, anytime somebody sets out to do their own curiosity of the Pulitzer Prize and they're doing it on their own and then it's guaranteed, means it's going to fail doomed from the start. And that the other movie is Ace in the Hole, that covers Kirk Douglas finding this guy stuck in a hole, and he's going to dig him out, but he has to wait a couple of days so they can get the right press coverage, and then the guy dies and he loses the Pulitzer, and then Kirk Douglas falls over dead. And it's so wonderful to be Elia Kazan when you're not a communist. But that Shot Corridor is a totally non-communistic plot because Samuel Fuller is absolutely extinct of all communist propaganda, and that he would never apply to the propaganda of communism, and anything inherent in Marxism is not for Samuel Fuller, and that he dejects that Red Party, and that he himself made Shot Corridor as a way to show the boundaries of what happens when we deliberate too far beyond the bounds of like thought crime, or thoughts that are not good for us or not healthy to even have. The way they contemplate things could be off, and so that there's this way of understanding that there's this psychology deeper motivated in helping him out, but that he ends up falling into because the state of psychology in that sense is not fully repaired to the family romance that we have today, where we try to match up inherent traits between parents and children to see where they could have found inherent traits that had then somehow become exaggerated upon being in consciousness and life and will and all the things that sensory perception are shaped by. And I think these things are the things that psychology deals with, so that Shot Corridor becomes this art film where there's this sudden blast of color and you're in like this African small town, but there's these idols everywhere and they're in color, and you can just see the camera wrap around and kind of build into this color montage, and that the color montage is on this version of it. And this is really hard to get a hold of disc. I don't know where I actually found this Criterion one on Shot Corridor, but it is black and white. I mean, that they were shooting in black and white till 67, really, even with Hollywood out of Hollywood films. Faster Pussycat Kill was around this time. But Samuel Fuller is an independent director, like John Cassavetes, in the sense that he makes his movies guerrilla verite style, that he does them in an uncanny sequence of what he has to shoot it with, but in a story that tells its own way through. Even though there's a script and written actors and every kind of munition that a regular director would call for, Samuel Fuller's got it, but that he's directing independently is because he makes films that are a bit different than other things. That the guy in Shot Corridor doesn't win the Pulitzer and ends up going insane in the hospital and actually falls into the system as someone who needs the hospital forever, comes from just being there. And there's this sort of idea, like this contagion of aberration that we've all been fearing, that he becomes insane from talking about insane things, and that leads him down the spiral. And there's another hopeless psychology ending for you in the 60s, and now we've lost interest in the film. But wait, we forget that he was already on a total reckless mission to get the Pulitzer, which can be reckless anyway because they ask you to do things that are above and beyond any expectation you've ever done before by anyone, except for maybe those that said you should get that and then come back, We've talked about that, and I'm not going to go into mine, but I'm saying that, like, there is always this reckless bit about it, and how you can get all mashed up in the midst of winning, and how you can not even win and think you would have gotten it, but now you've got bigger fish to fry, like figuring out the very murder that you were going to chart and put in the book. That Shot Corridor's visuals are the corridors of shock, down to the very close range of the electric shock treatment that is only a little bit shown in action in this film, but in a way that even goes to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, how they're going to design that film for the mentally ill perspective, and that it's going to be dramatic for how they reach healing through the power of befriending others. And Shot Corridor takes that and drains it all out and says, here he is. He's in the asylum. Now he's here to write about it, but now he's already losing his mind. And I'm not saying that you would instantly lose your mind in an auditorium of only asylums, but that you would finally complicate your own language to be like, theirs is also a desolate look at it. I'm leaving it to psychologists. Someone who's a psychologist will have to become a great filmmaker, and he'll be like the Young of filmmakers, and he'll show us all how you're supposed to treat the situation. But so far in these kind of like paradox movies about the psychologist is always there to like do nothing but clone Hitler in The Boys of Brazil, for instance. I mean, it's like, what more do you want than to have the totally worst thing that could happen? And that's never come from my psychologist, and I'm not just saying that. I mean, they always have good ideas on how to live a healthy life and continue life to the fullest. So why would I be in dastardly display of having to go the Shot Corridor route and being like, well, I don't know, I feel like I should be punished for even thinking outside the norm, And then they'd be like, well, they wouldn't ask if I'd been watching Shot Corridor, but these existential movies do have a core at them, like The Man Escaped by Robert Bresson. I mean, you have the same thing with Shot Corridor, that these images, these impressions show you where you're at in the dungeon of despair, but that Shot Corridor takes you further into the madness of what can be an asylum without the Marquis de Sade asylum look of Marat Sade that we're not going to talk about too much. But even those solo movies that end in an asylum, that totally end in apocalyptic, mayhem, are in the same line of business as Shot Corridor, which is shock art. That he's using the same thing that Naked Kiss is as a title, and like putting it together as this film noir epic that only the 1963, that's the year Fellini's 8.5 came out. So now please do not tell me that Samuel Fuller gets any less attention than any other director, and his right-wing stance against communism may have reserve, but his way of telling a story in visuals lasted all the way through his career, from A Pickup on South Street all the way through White Dog and other movies like Shark and things he did that were original. And I think that Samuel L. Fuller deserves our attention as director, and that he does contemplate these things about even why it's madness to try and go for the Pulitzer Prize if you're already putting yourself in a reckless but not sure of the outcome situation to get the thing, and that like you kind of have to do that to get it, but it makes no sense because 9 times out of 10 that's going to get a rejection because it was the wrong point of execution, and that he doesn't even submit for one. And even in Ace in the Hole, when the Pulitzer's maybe talked about as a possibility, it still fails out over the guy dying in the tunnel. Too soon, too late, it doesn't matter. They're going to have to face it. These are harder things to get than most film writers can even face the facts that they don't get just for making movies. Louisiana Story took a Pulitzer Prize actually by director Robert Flaherty, and he made a lot of interesting people turn their heads with the realism of that movie, and the realism of that movie is so staunch. And I can't really tell you about it other than it's swampland like I've never seen, but some of it's not wasteland, some of it's actually useful swampland, if you can imagine that. And these are things that are very delicate to the psychology and the political. And then I don't think Samuel Fuller wants to stop thought crime as bad as to install the shock corridor over it. But the reckless endangerment sometimes has its results in the most reckless situations. And that's why I'm leading up to my next discussion. And I may not discuss this long because we've gone through so many classes and we've seen so many different voices on these movies that we're getting to. And I feel the film criticism of the critical has led us to these two films that are art films, that are independent films, one by Charles Laughton, one by the repeat offender Samuel Fuller. And that they're these, again, are they melodramas? I think they're suspense thrillers. They're in the Hitchcock way. That this is kind of like a Spellbound, and this is kind of a Man Who Knew Too Much kind of original version with Peter Lorre, is already kind of scaring me into thinking there's Hitchcock overtones to every suspense thriller, which there is. But now we're going directly to the Platonic thing to do, and that's to talk about soldiers, and boy do we love soldiers, and here's where we love soldiers. And now we finally get a Kubrick film that we can say that we love the film, we want more of the film, and everything about the film that seems offensive is like it really is in boot camp, and we thank you for being so realistic. That I've pointed out before, that war movies, even Vietnam movies, which kind of take it over the top in a way because a fourth less people died in Vietnam than in World War II, but I'm not saying it wasn't just as devastating to lose a quarter of that people, and that it was horrible to lose any people to Vietnam, especially when we were just holding back communists and the communist bloc. That Green Berets comes out in the 60s and shows how we can win the war by sacrificing a woman to the other side to spy on them, like Notorious by Alfred Hitchcock. It all goes back to Hitchcock. Hitchcock's making war movies like Notorious. Things are getting interesting, and now we have Full Metal Jacket. Now, Full Metal Jacket's another one of these bend backward on itself titles like Kubrick's used to, that it's full metal and that it's a jacket that you wear it, and it's metal. It's like you wear a metal jacket because it's like your jacket's made of bullets when you put it on, and that it's a full metal jacket is also the jacket that covers the bullet that comes out of the shell when it's shot. And I think that it's important to know that only because if you're John Locke and someone's attacking your property, you might have to fight in self-defense. No, I'm kidding. I actually don't really advocate so much either way for gun use. I'm not going to do that on my show and take a political position, especially when I went through Night of the Hunter and Shock Corridor and so kindly didn't go into the political position of those films, because I think the folklore and mythology is right-wing in both these films, but aren't they also the excesses of capitalism that are right-wing, that lead us to desire the things that are outside of our limitation, that lead us to these boundaries of sin, despair, and absolute extinction of the other, that is usually the female fatale, being reversed into a subjective objective position where the female is held prisoner until either exterminated or an illusory force sets her free. Well, the illusory force that sets her free in Shock Corridor is her getting the heck out now that she knows her husband's gone completely winchy down the spiral of eternity, and that Night of the Hunter has no reprieve except that Lillian Gish carries a huge freaking shotgun, and she's got it aimed Elmer's Road style right at Robert Mitchum's face in case he tries to take the kids. Now we're in Full Metal Jacket with more gunplay and more of the praise ye cinema type attitude that we're going to have, because actually Full Metal Jacket's not really film noir like those other two, that it's only a little bit of a thriller at the end. It kind of takes a thriller point of view and goes in kind of this, well, I'll just tell you about the ending. There's a sniper up in the shelf of somewhere nearby in Vietnam that's all torn down, and most of the field has been conquered, and all the soldiers are still alive pretty much from all the previous missions that they've been victorious on for quite a run, and that they've filmed some of their examples, and that they've buddied all since part 2, since they got out of boot camp, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But in the part where the sniper rifle is aimed at him, it's actually one of the Vietnamese girls that's been exploited earlier, and she's shooting, and she's a real good shot, and she lures him out and shoots about 5 of them, and they finally catch her and shoot her down, and it's this whole dramatic sequence. And I don't like to get into the dark side of Stanley Kubrick, because the dark side of Stanley Kubrick is a real dark place, and it's about as dark as they get. As one of the, and I'm not judging him that he's like a bad person, because all his movies are cynical and skeptical and can totally end with a surprise and can totally bring you to what you thought was cool about the Vietnam War, but then what's so heinous about it, and what really we don't ever get in a real war movie, except for maybe Night and Fog, which is like a real documentary, is the horrors of war. And the horrors of war are those Night and Fog things, those skulls lying on the ground of our killed enemy. I mean, like, there are things that are really horrible about war that are only shown in bits and pieces throughout the war films of even Griffith and Spielberg and these traditional war film type filmmakers that show the battle getting strategically unbearing, but that there is hope for the human race if they carry out the mission. Even if they get martyred and die during it, they're still serving that Platonic need to save a savior, and that's to introduce the soldier as the savior theory, that the soldier is put into battle as the savior is given, and that if he happens to be from America, then you'd have to base the right history on where that came from, because not always is the case that there was an American savior, although soldiers happen to be the strongest from all these movies that we're saying, even these Vietnam movies, we're saying these men were heroes. Now, this men were heroes attitude is in Full Metal Jacket, but they also seem like anti-heroes nonetheless. And that's because the film plays itself back and forth both ways. The thing about the boot camp is it teaches you to hate as much as you love. So that you're pressing forward, and that you've got the same knuckles as Robert Mitchum in Night of the Hunter. One says love, one says hate, and that you've got to contradict yourself all the way to become one of these natural-born soldiers. And these natural-born soldiers are coming out of these modules that are filmed in corridor shots. Again, like Shot Corridor eliminates a lot of other kinds of shots, but always has the corridor leading up to the shock chamber. I mean, this is the same kind of thing with these boot camp sequences. These sweeping under camera movements, that tracking shots that go through and past the soldiers and see the boot camp officer walking by, and you can't but help but notice some symmetry to the shot, and that it has those same effects that like Barry Lyndon had years before, and that it's out after The Shining, between Barry Lyndon, is only one film in between, and The Shining is kind of this unwandered masterpiece of cinema history that no one knows what to do with. They kind of just plug it as, well, Kubrick wasn't wrong, Stephen King wasn't wrong, everybody that loves this film was right to love it. That it's a different film than the book seemed to be was a lot like most Stephen King's seemed to be different in the movie than the book. The Full Metal Jacket came after The Shining, and it could have actually been the best way for Kubrick to end, but who am I to judge? Maybe one day Eyes Wide Shut will rise again as an important film. I think it's kind of a mix-up with that one. I think if I were to see the version of Eyes Wide Shut that were made in, say, Brazil, or, let's just go for Belgium. If I saw the Belgium version of Eyes Wide Shut, who knows, the Belgium film industry might have drilled in some scenes of the Keebler elves running through there. I'm not trying to be nasty. I'm just saying there could have been something so bizarre in the filmmaking qualities of the Iowa print of even Mulholland Drive that it's worth describing in shot-by-shot analysis what happens after Pandora's box flips over and the parents run out small, and we've always questioned that about Mulholland Drive, and how all he was doing was meditating on the set, and everything kept happening the way he had planned it to happen anyway before he had meditated it out, and that while he was meditating, he was seeing the things in one respect or dimension that were moving that he was or wasn't supposed to be filming. And I think the off-screen space in a David Lynch film is just like, give me a break. It's torched out obvious that his off-screen space is going to be your best use of it, because his whole set is conducive to a meditative set. And this says it's the best horror movie ever made. Toronto Globe and Mail, we can trust Toronto on that. That it's really realistic, not realistic enough. That it's Apocalypse Now, but in a 2-part series. Boot Camp That Killed Me and Killed the Boot Camp Officer led to the war that almost killed me, to the sniper that killed me, to back to the Mickey Mouse Club. And that there's all these stories intertwined, like there's things with the prostitute, there's things again where they have a camera with a homemade movie going on in Vietnam, that they've got all the specs of being buddies, but that they're at a distance because they have to be effective war machines of their own, and that Matthew Modine's running the newspaper in the second half, and that it's the same crew that all boot camped together and thought they wouldn't make it, and treated Gomer Pyle so bad that he killed himself and killed the captain. But it was really the captain that was putting Gomer Pyle to all that stress in the first place and was causing all that trouble. So now we see through Full Metal Jacket for what it is as a film. It is an excellent Kubrick film. That Goodbye, My Darling, Kiss Me, Vietnam is one thing that I do remember it playing, and the hair is coming off at the same rate as the drum beat is going in the song. That there's Jung is mentioned in this film, Carl Jung, and I said Carl Jung should make one of these psychological movies. Well, this could be where the psychology comes in of Carl Jung, because now we're talking about good versus evil, peace versus killing, death versus life, and there's all these questions about like dualism, and does it make sense that each action has a reaction that's opposite, and that you have to pair off the thesis and antithesis of everything to make sense out of what the world is. And I think that Kubrick does enough corridor shots to say, look, we're aestheticizing the violence, but this time we're making you so inundated with the process of getting to be a war machine that once we are, we're still looking at the human side and saying, well, he's fading back into the Mickey Mouse Club. This is a good news. This is worthwhile. And so far, these movies that I put out, now Stanley Kubrick wasn't exactly an independent filmmaker, but we all know the story is that when he came to Spartacus to be a full-fledged Hollywood director after The Killing and Paths of Glory and Killer's Kiss, In Fear and Desire, he came upon Spartacus, and Spartacus led the way for him to do exactly what he wanted to do in that film, except he had to take out one scene with Olivier kind of hitting on Tony Curtis's character, and it was kind of a gay scene they had to take out. Kubrick was so annihilated they took it out that he wanted his name off of it, even though the film was almost identical to what he storyboarded originally. They say that Kirk Douglas took control of the film and made it back the Stanley Kubrick way, and that Stanley Kubrick was so offended they weren't going to let one of his scenes in that he almost did go back and help Dalton Trumbo get his name back off while he was still blacklisted. But the film came out with the credits it did and venerated them all into the mainstream. That Lolita was a total strikeout. The Doctor Strangelove was great, but had to be banned for political reasons. JFK was assassinated around that time, so they pulled political thrillers, and then it was a comedy made it worse. So there's disaster after disaster. 2001, not a disaster, but challenges views about the origin of man that are all controversial. Do aliens exist? Do computers do their own thinking? All these science questions of the future becoming very hypothetical and very metaphorically plausible in this sort of starscape of the future that did work as a film that he didn't have to go back and apologize for, and actually could say it was the one he did the best with. Did you get to Clockwork Orange and have to pretty much pitch it out after what we've been discussing? I do like the references in Green Day and Bart Simpson's references, and I can't deny some of those punk references of that movement seem viable. That there's just certain things I disagree with how they handled some of the psychological references. Again, it's like that whole shock corridor thing. Not everybody that's a psychologist is like just waiting there at the boundary line saying the minute you go beyond the normal thought, we're gonna punish you. I mean, nobody's like that at all. And I'm here to attest that that's not what psychology is about. It's about curing the human mind, and it's not going to put you in a cage and rattle you around and hope that you can do the best you can do under extreme circumstances and anything like that. That's not psychology, and that's what they're using in the movie. And that I kind of put those movies aside and say, well, they're similar in debt, but that Shock Corridor handles it at such a strange interlude of him just putting himself in as a trick to theatrically play it out, and then he suddenly has to be in there. That's suddenly where he has to be. All right, we're honing in on one more film before we close shop tonight, and this is one I've got to get out there. Well, I know we don't have any soundtrack going, but these are like banging good films, and this Kubrick one reminds me of Sidney Lumet, and Sidney Lumet himself is so complex that he's Murder on the Orient Express guy, but that he's also 12 Angry Men's guy. And that he did so many movies like Network that 12 Angry Men actually has a saying in it that becomes a saying in this: I'm mad as hell, but I just can't take it anymore. That's the saying from Network. And that everybody goes to the window, the rooftop to shout it: I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Then everybody gets their job shifted around the next day because we're going through to ratings night, and ratings are higher than ever now that the guys are taking control of their own show and writing their own material and coming up with it off the top of their head. And that I'm not coming up with any of this off the top of my head, that I read scores of film books to get to where I got, and that I sat through scores of USC lectures, and that these have to be right to the letter of USC. And that I think about Full Metal Jacket, and one thing we missed is kind of this monster, this like Freudian Oedipal monster of the Frankenstein doctor, the boot camp instructor, and Gomer Pyle is kind of the Frankenstein monster. And the Frankenstein monster kills the boot camp instructor because it's Dr. Frankenstein, and he's got to kill him because he's the creature. And then he blows himself up. It's kind of the way Frankenstein, the one by James Whale, ends. And then you think, well, maybe that's where they're getting this part one of Full Metal Jacket apocalypse of Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein monster in front of everyone, because he's created a monster. He's created this obligatory killer that only has one thing in mind, and it's to kill him, because the whole project backfired and somehow his psychology went into derangement at some point in the process of becoming a soldier. He had snapped That was the end of it. But network takes a different route. This is a more liberal film, but it's in the 70s when being liberal is all about still being iconic and rugged individualism. We'll say that all the great people are in it. William Holden, I mean, he's in Bridge on River Kwai. William Holden's in Sabrina. I mean, William Holden's in The Wild Bunch. William Holden's in the movie Picnic. He's in a lot of good movies, and we said Bridge on River Kwai, and that he's in this network movie. These are all masterpieces. I'm missing a few, of his even more incredible movie roles, and he goes from role to role, being this champion, being this pillar of legend, and these are all TV legends, and this is what we think of our TV legends, is that they're legends. And there's one thing about this movie is in its approach to make TV look like a lesser medium than film, as it is being done on film, as a film featuring a TV show. It is, in fact, valorizing in its own way the TV character personalities through exaggeration and making them seem bigger than life, that the characterizations of these actors are exactly what we think of our TV people, and how their lives get mixed up in both things that are Hollywood scandals that are like gossip, all the way to TV personas, all the way to important news and things to know about the heartbeat of America that are actually being written as the news is being written, as it already is written, but they're catching up to where they're supposed to be each day on the news. And I know that I'm showing these film noir movies that are kind of like modern, and that the theme of all these movies are that they're modernistic, and that the heritage of the metaphors in Shot Corridor are the very Shot Corridors, the bars, the electrocutions, the asylum. I mean, that's the structuring metaphor of the film. Also, the color shots of the meditation of the Zen Buddha garden. In this, we have the waters, the boat, the rain, the things that happen through baptism, the grandma that sits out in the rain with a shotgun. I mean, there are metaphors throughout this film that make it more like a fairy tale of the big bad wolf. And I'm telling you, it's a scary version that Robert Mitchum, when he did Cape Fear, was drastically on as the villain, and that in Network, all the characters are like villains, and then in Full Metal Jacket, they're almost like these types of puppet theater that are more like amiable to each other's movements, but in a squadron also concerned about the return to camp and further instructions for their heroism that is shown, regardless of it stripped away from a sniper that takes down most of the ranks. In another hell of kind of a Bride of Frankenstein, total apocalypse theme, the Bride of Frankenstein has now destroyed everyone else at the end of Full Metal Jacket. Now, I like how Network has Robert Duvall, and he's another one like William Holden. He'll show up in To Kill a Mockingbird, and he'll show up in Godfather 1 and 2 as the lawyer, and he'll show up in The Apostle as this preacher, and that Robert Duvall knows his career every step of the way, has chosen his favorite parts and played them, that he's great in Network, and that it's about how they get ratings through sensationalism, but it's a sensational movie kind of exploiting sensationalism, but at last critiquing sensationalism as though that is something that's overdone on TV, but has to be, but the film is able to critique it by seeing through it, or for what it is, or for what it already admits it is, but now we're saying it is too, because that's what we take the liberty as a film to be above the show, but that we're making the show the movie is totally a contradiction, because now we've got the show out as the movie, so now we've got to really exaggerate it out and say this is TV, when really we're saying this is film, and we're mixing it all up. And I like when we mix it all up on accident, because he's going to narrow it down to just say, well, we've got these 4 coinciding subplots with at least the pictures we see on the cover of Network, that there's 7 or 8 actual plots, and that they're all working in a Sidney Lumet fashion of, using an ensemble cast. And I'll tell you, Robert Altman is a good ensemble cast director, but Sidney Lumet directed really good pictures with cast that was ensemble as well as only with one star, that he's got it all, he can do it all. We know from his films, and they started with 12 Angry Men, and he was directing all through the 60s, that City of New York is one of his most difficult films to take. And I do believe The Pawnbroker is his most difficult film to take. That it's the one where they have Roy Scheider. Yeah, Roy Scheider is a Jew escaped and lived through the Holocaust. And he looks back and sees his flashbacks to the camp throughout while he's trying to be a pawnbroker. And it's a really depressing film, and I only bring it up because it's Sidney Lumet, who's such theatrical realism, such documentary realism, that he becomes this realist of his own in this social media context. And The Network is the perfect film when it comes to social media and how the adjustment of one angle from another angle will completely distort the media in the way that will coerce the spectator to the one side or the other. And that I've noticed one thing about TV these days is as mixed politics as you get between the different networks and how they each try and govern their own political space. It's interesting, the ones at the far right and the ones at the far left are actually sponsoring and sponsored by the same commercials on both channels. So I'm wondering if they're being paid by the same people. Don't they really come from the same question? They're just answering it in two ways. And I don't know if that's a very fair way to say, well, you should look at it one way or the other. But I'm just saying, aren't they using the same money to sponsor both sides of the campaign? And did anyone think about that? It's like, well, if they use Coke on their side, we should use Pepsi on ours. And I don't know if people think about that, or if that's like we just learned that in Moneyball, so slow down type concept. Maybe. I don't really know much about accounting. Heck, I don't do my own accounting. If you look through the movies I just went through, that was at least $100 worth, maybe more, that I've lost some movies, even demonstrating them on the show, what they are worth. And this is not really a show, but that it counts as your college course. And I would recommend, if you're going to see one of these movies, see Full Metal Jacket. It might be the most compatible to your viewing experience, being used to the language of film from at least the 90s when Full Metal Jacket was made. And that actually it was made in 1987, excuse me. But that it's war pumped up, and that it's war even to the point of Apocalypse Now. Just remember that war footage is never as severe as war really is. And the only time I've ever seen it that way was Night and Fog. And that's a French New Wave film. So I wouldn't even want to go down that route, because those are extremely realistic, and most of those scenes are from inside the movie and everything. So that if you're going to watch Full Metal Jacket, if you can't handle Night of the Hunter and Shock Corridor because they're too intense and too hard, but if you do ever think about getting a Pulitzer, you should watch Shock Corridor and Ace in the Hole, just so you psych yourself out enough to go even crazier over it. No, never do that. That'd be terrible. Alright, Network is what I'm coming up with next, because I think Sensibilities Today, and since the censors worked with the terrorists in this film, theoretically speaking, metaphorically displayed on screen, that there was so much to do with men's libido and how it gets them power in the industry is so amazing, about the gossip rag being partially true and partially part and partial to the media's expenditures, is on that kind of publicity stunt that deals with the romance among even the speakers and the news anchors and everybody else that's in the room with them that's producing the show. And I think that one of the hierarchies of the newscast is broken up by Ned Beatty's final redemption scene in all the 70s, that he'd been so abused in Deliverance earlier that we thought he'd never have his comebacks, but that he came back as God in Network was the ultimate heaven send, because Ned Beatty comes down with he's got a real crush, and its burning desire is to bring to earth God's message of TV and cinema, and that is commercials and the money made by commercial TV and that commercial TV answers itself the question, what is it here for other than to be commercial TV? And I'm telling you, there are a lot of really beautiful things that we learned about TV in that first semester, and I feel it was a class that we didn't rely heavily enough on, and that we came back to it and we were kind of savvy with TV criticism and kind of looking to like find these bricolages of big chunks of TV and media, and that like TV has all become the internet, and the internet's all together with TV. And if you think about it, even this class, while it's being recorded in one fell swoop each time I give a lecture, is all on a screen later that you're screening on your media. And so now it's on a streaming media format, so you can play it from any part of the show and watch it from there, and that we're creating streaming media, but that we're not directing an actual movie is clear, that I'm not sitting here casting directions all over the set. That I am coming up with this off the top of my head is only because this is a closed book challenge to me to teach the class right without making mistakes, and with moving forward if we get hung up in expression, which we had a couple of times, and I apologize for that, because I had not come to the Samuel L. Fuller full exaggeration of not just why I don't want to get into why he's right wing and serves the left below, to anything structurally communist and Marxist has to go. And we could strike a note at that. We could say network does the opposite and carves into deconstruction and looks at demythologization and looks at the ways to break down stereotypes and mythologies and hierarchies and things that would flatten the environment as less than feminist or less than liberal, and that they're going for the ultimate ideal, which is to make TV their utopia, to talk about commercial TV rather than what the host, Peter Finch, was talking about, was an independent thinker, and independent thinkers had the right to their own TV channel. For a while, he was popular with the independent thinker point of view, and that's one of the most absurd parts about the movie, is he's killed when he changes from that point of view to the point of view Ned Beatty tells him to, and then he's killed anyway. So it's like rebounded by the precept that he's going to be put out by the same people that are telling him to say what it is that's going to put him out, and therefore the conspiracy is complete. He's spoken his final scripted dialogue and gone out with a total bang. And then, like, he's the first guy on television to die for the ratings of a TV show, is what the guy says at the end of the movie, and you're just kind of in awe that you're still looking at this soundstage where Peter Finch just gets blasted down. And that Peter Finch died soon after the making of this movie is another one of those legendary 70s movies that was made right before the actor that was in the movie died, and that he seemed to have come back to life just for one last bow in each movie that he dies in. Is not similar to just Peter Finch, but that there have been other abandoned characters that have died right as their movies come out, or right around the time their movies come out. They made it seem like the movie they were working on was the one that they went out on, and that's a total publicity wagon that we don't have to get involved with, but I'm sure they ate up every minute of it with Network, because the point of the movie Network is to be cynical. So if they're eating up every point of view that's making money, then they're just eating up the money. But from a cynical, we're just going to kind of hang on to it and see if it floats kind of angle. I don't know. But anyway, Flannel Jacket and Network I'm assigning you to. You should check those films out. They're American. We looked at American films today. I was pretty surprised that of all the silent films and foreign films and things we pull out normally, that we got some movies that we really need to get around to as film buffs, to looking into and making great notes of. And I would say The Night of the Hunter deserves great notes for film noir, neo-noir, modernism, and the fairy tale genre of tall tales and fairy tales and folklore in American mythology, from Louisiana Story to Night of the Hunter, right? Because we don't know what we don't know what Charles Lawton is going to put us through in this sort of run the ride out and see where it's going to lead you to, in terms of finding out the nature of good versus evil, or love versus hate, or the things that we don't want to confront that are pushed at us until they're made known. And then when Sheley Winters dies, us as the audience becomes dreadfully afraid for the future of these children, and this whole suspense thriller is played out in this ambiguous way. Like, will the children be safe? Will this big bad wolf be pointed with a shotgun at and chased off the grounds? We have to see that as these different ways of interpreting Night of the Hunter, and then we get to Shot Corridor, and we're like totally blown away by the fact that his plan for the Pulitzer is so ridiculous that it fades away after like 3 scenes into the movie, and that's just the premise he got himself in on, and that may have been a good premise to get himself in on, because now he's forgotten exactly what he came for, but that he's becoming part of the system right away is already sinking in, and that he at first was playing a role, supposedly saying that he's going to be in this place as a patient that needs help, but that he's doing this thing that's already set up in other psychological films where he's becoming dormant like the surroundings of the shot corridor, and that he's falling for its surroundings, like Page of Madness, for instance, in Japan in 1927, where there is a contagion of socially irreverent behavior depending on which no mask the prisoners wore. And I don't know enough about that, but that I do know that Shot Corridor does in fact envision almost those same no masks and those same sacrificial wanderings and gatherings, that something like a Pulitzer could be won if it wasn't Samuel L. Fuller, and so not left-wing oriented, but still kind of is. That even One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest has an image somewhat like Shot Corridor, in whereas psychology has not been revised. Psychology not being revised for the cinema is one of the shortcomings that even came from the philosophy of 68, which showed that subject-object positioning could be reversed from female to male. Therefore, I do not think that psychology was as behind as was illustrated in some of these cinematic versions, that I'm still looking for the one directed by Carl Jung I haven't found, but that there are some interesting films about him we could talk about all day. And that I just want to skip ahead and say Full Metal Jacket again. And Network, again, if you haven't seen Network, it's the cinema trying to show us that TV is below us, but that the TV below us defines the cinema it shows us, is really good. And again, Full Metal Jacket for the Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein double feature. You can't go wrong. And that, like, everybody misses out on those moments that are essentially Kubrick, the corridor shots, the match on action, the POV, the wrecked soul, the movement back to the place he was before, the fold in of part 1, part 2, the labyrinth back and forth through the maze, the things, the components, the structuring metaphors in Full Metal Jacket being the guns that are shooting, or the running in the trenches, or the song, the soundtrack itself shaping structuring metaphors just in its montages that it's following out to the setting sun in the deserts of Vietnam. And that reminds me, was there ever a war film that was ever as devastating as the war itself? And Show is pretty close, but it's more of a Holocaust film. And Night and Fog, again, I repeat, and it's just it's a film that I don't really want to get into, but it shows the truth of the Holocaust and what it's made and what it's all about, and is only 30 minutes long. And it's a film that I can't live without it in terms of what it does for me psychologically, to know that we knew the war was going on then, but that's right around the time that it was stopped, and it was 10 years after when it was happening. Is such a disparity in how long it takes to actually communicate a media event in the era before these multimedia, multitasking live shots could be set up the minute a crisis was occurring anywhere in the world. And we've come a long way with these technologies that have driven us through future medias that are usually used for those ideas that can help people and reach out and get connected with someone that can help you if you need security and help. And you don't have to go face a road alone, and you don't have to face the fear that I think some of these movies engender, that no one's going to help you and that there is going to be this monster that's going to crush you. But one thing I do like about these movies is there's always this tall tale of some brilliantly good force that will come along and be your kind of guide and mentor through the quest. And that's always the case, that someone will find your durability, what makes you an unbelievable artist, and they will take that in you and bring you to the next step of artistry. And if right now we're reeling it in and saying, this is what we appreciate of other people's artistry in film, that we appreciate Charles Laughton coming out for just one film and just seeing how good he can get, and that he's right on the level of like Strangers on a Train at the same token as a few years before, and that there's this whole suspense thriller filibuster now between all the directors, and it totally comes back to Network, which is another kind of suspense, down to the wire message, that everything has to be down to the wire and right at the exact moment, is a Network thing. And that, I don't know whether to laugh or cry at Full Metal Jacket when it takes me through both emotions. But the more I watch it, it's the one Kubrick film that doesn't really get old to me, that I can set up all the scenarios in the film in my mind and see a freshly imaged through film is to the context that it's barely dated at all, if not dated. So if you want to look at the art of preserving films to make them look not dated, look at tonight's 4 that we covered, and that's really hard to date, that you couldn't really stick those in an era other than some of the exploitation of shot corridor. It's going to be really hard in 100 years to remember that those weren't the typical films chosen for the modern movement, which those are only some of. Touch of Evil added, Third Man, the added performance, But that's it. That's the core of these cinematic values, is that they're there for these rich textures of conduits into human understanding and the soul as it's tormented by whatever threshold guardian. And we thank you for coming to Masterclass, or for listening or viewing Masterclass. We ask that you throw all your garbage away, clean up your area as you head out. And as you look around, you're seeing friends, you're seeing people you can collaborate with. You might want to get in touch with them and see what kind of things were on last semester's final, because we still have 7 weeks before the end of this term, and that's a lot more classes. 7 classes, excuse me, and that may be only over the course of 5 weeks if we can put these classes together in that ordinance of time, and that we're going to stick with all the best rushes that we have. We had a lot of fun with you tonight. We're not really disturbed if you take this class way later and are auditing it now for the units that come with 16 blocks or 16 hours of masterclass, and that there's 7 hours to go, I've already stated, and that this is Dr. Sheley of the Arts, wishing you all a very good night. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.